30 to 40% of cancers are preventable using diet and lifestyle. And this is only a short amount of time, 20 years. So hopefully in the next 10 years, as we have more research between the link between insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome and cancer, more people will start to understand this.
It's as if there's this new interconnection, or a better understanding of the interconnection of many conditions that people are experiencing that are all growing in society. We're getting really significant increasing cancer rates, especially breast cancer rates are going up really significantly. But we've also got, from the metabolic health side, we've got increasing fatty liver disease, liver cancer rates are going up, we've got bowel cancer rates are going up. Then we also have diabetes rates going up. Like it's exploding in lots of different directions, which for many people may seem not connected. They may seem like separate completely, but actually there's an emerging picture that these are all often really interconnected together.
And if we think about also neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, it could potentially be considered as type 3 diabetes, because there's definitely a link between diet and lifestyle and Alzheimer's and these plaques forming in your brain. And I think it's really our lifestyles and our diets, and we can't separate those out. They're different aspects. So we have to look at our nutrition, what we're actually eating, but also the timing of our food. When are we eating? What are we eating at what time of day? So if we look at menopause, because there's some really good research there now, and we're starting to understand, and I think Dr. Sarah Berry talks about this, but they did some research to understand that if you're perimenopausal or menopausal, when you eat your carbohydrates makes a difference.
Let's just really understand that. What happens during perimenopause and then after, or during the menopause, which is after periods of stopped?
So I think it's really important for us to understand, because 80% of breast cancer at least happen in women that are postmenopausal. Now, there's so much interesting research happening in the menopause space, but Dr. Sarah Berry at King's College did some research where they looked at carbohydrate intake at different times of the day for perimenopausal, menopausal women. And what they found was that if you're eating your carbohydrates earlier in the day, your insulin response is working better than if you're eating your carbohydrates later in the day. And maybe there's conferring some sort of insulin resistance or some difference with insulin processing later in the day. What we also know is when people go through perimenopause and menopause, there is definitely some increased insulin resistance. And that's because there's a real link between our estrogen, progesterone, insulin response. And plus our body composition also starts to change because we start to lose a muscle mass after menopause. And we also know that muscles are a really important buffer for insulin. So this is where it becomes really interesting, because where women's health really changes more than men, really between like 40 and 50, those kind of ages. It could be as young as 35. But there's a much bigger change in women because their body is changing so much because of this drop in estrogen, progesterone, and how it impacts all the different aspects of their body work, including metabolism. And then this changes their body composition, where they lose muscle mass, and obviously it impacts their bone health too. And this loss of muscle mass changes body composition, which also, when you then ends up often gaining belly fat essentially, and that belly fat, that visceral fat, can also further impact your insulin resistance.
Well, people associate getting older with an increasing risk of cancer. So naturally, as we're getting older, as women get older, they reach this point of menopause, and then there's an increased risk of cancers as well. So I think a lot of people would just associate it with age. But this is an interesting narrative. This is suggesting that the changes related to menopause might be then potentially increasing risk. And you mentioned around muscle loss as well. I find this interesting because with weight and having excess fat, in terms of the drivers for increasing the risk of cancer, this is partly related to estrogen and how estrogen can increase the risk of inflammatory mediators, which could then potentially, along the pathways, lead to an increased risk of developing cancer. But when we go through menopause, we reduce the amount of estrogen.
Yes.
So would that potentially, so from one aspect, one would say, well, hold on a minute, why isn't the risk reduced? But what is the but?
So the but, well, there's obviously different buts. So I think let's address there's two different things I want to talk about. First of all is our risk of cancer increases with our age. whatever gender you are, because when it comes to our DNA, it becomes a little bit more unstable. And if you think about the fact that you're kind of almost photocopy your DNA over and over and over again, there becomes a lot more mistakes, a lot of things which are changed. So that's one aspect which is linked to cancer. The second one, when it comes like obviously to menopause and stuff, is that as our body produce more estrogen, reduces the amount of estrogen it produces through perimenopause and menopause, our body wants the estrogen because there's estrogen receptors all over our body. So sometimes putting on body fat, because body fat is actually makes estrogen and estradiol. And so we have to, that's potentially also the massive link to our body wants to counteract that because it needs the estrogen. So I think it's endlessly fascinating.
You're essentially saying that even though estrogen drops, because of the changing body composition with menopause and the fact that we put on more fat more easily rather than muscle, actually that is still driving an estrogen pathway. But I couldn't get this from the research papers, but it seemed to infer to me, and you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, if from what you know, is the estrogen production and the way in which that leads to an inflammatory response different to the estrogen that's being created when women are fertile?
So we don't know enough about that. That's a problem. And it does look like there is a difference between that estrogen that's been produced by the body fat as opposed to the ovaries. So we don't make one form of estrogen, we make 5 different types. And I think this is where we need to understand more. What forms of estrogen are we producing, or estradiol? And then the other aspect, which people forget about, is not only do you have to make the estrogen, whether you're male or female, because men have just as much, have quite a lot of estrogen too, but you also have to use it and metabolize it and break it down. Now, one of the things that's really, really kind of maybe linked to this increasing risk of breast cancer, prostate cancer, hormone-linked cancers, is that our bodies and our modern lifestyles are not necessarily compatible to breaking down and detoxifying this used, spent estrogen. And that obviously becomes worse as you get older. And then you talked about fatty liver and metabolic syndrome. Obviously, we know our liver's one of the main metabolic organs. So if our liver's not working so well and your liver's required to break down these estrogen metabolites, then there's going to be some left in your body. And that is where things hanging around long in your body could potentially increase the risk of cancer.
Oh, I wish we could keep it simple for people.
I know, but
it's hard, isn't it? But on the complicated, yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why you need a podcast and a discussion about it rather than just saying, this is what you do. I think it's really hard to just tell people. And often people want to know the context of why they should be doing something. But just on the complexity subjects, you mentioned a couple of things which might be worth clarifying. You mentioned something called mitochondria and you mentioned free radicals. Could you provide a bit more of an explanation to people who don't understand how that fits in context with everything else and what they are?
Yeah. So mitochondria are essentially our cells' batteries. They make energy for us. And these developed actually, how did life develop? And, obviously there might be religious people who might say otherwise, but generally we know that, life developed as single cellular organisms. And what we start to understand is that those single cell organisms kind of banded together to make us as multicellular organisms. And the mitochondria were those early kind of single cell organisms which knew how to harness energy from oxygen and food and change us into human beings. So that if we just think about it as being the battery cells, the battery packs of our cells and our bodies. Now, just like batteries run out or batteries stop to work well, or you need to recharge them, there is the same thing with our mitochondria. They may not work so well as they get older. So like if you have some batteries in your TV remote, eventually you have to get to a point where you're pressing the remote 100 times because then batteries aren't working so well, and then you need to change the batteries. Obviously, as people, we can't change our mitochondria, but we can think about how we can help to work them better. So is that enough of it?
Totally. I mean, I think that helps people understand, and I think I would add that it's the mitochondria that's helping to create the energy. That's what creates the ATP, which is the energy from the glucose. And so it's the transformer, because the glucose isn't the energy directly. We have to turn it into something that can be used as energy. So when mitochondria doesn't work very well, then we can't create energy very well, essentially. No. But that's where the free radicals comes in, isn't it?
So part of the process of making energy in our mitochondria from glucose is the creation of free radicals. And if you think about, it's really hard to explain, but if you think about, let's just say you had something like, let's say orange with like 2 spokes sticking out of it. And then normally those 2 spokes are attached to something. In free radicals, only one of them is attached. So that means it's free to grab onto something else. And that's what free radicals are. So it grabs onto other things, and that can create damage to our DNA. Our DNA is our blueprint for ourselves, which tells our body what to do. And you can switch genes on and off. And that's an area that I'm particularly interested in. How do we use diet and lifestyle to switch genes on and off? But anyway, going back to this free species, this is why a diet can make a huge difference, because when we eat foods that are often more higher in, produce more of an insulin response, or higher in sugar, or higher ultra processed foods, it can create more free radicals, because when we're trying to convert that energy, and then you need antioxidants. So these are all the beautiful things in food, like the colors that give, like carrots a color, or berries its color. Those are all called antioxidants, or spices, or any of those things, turmeric. Those can actually bind to those spokes on the orange and to stop them reacting with other things. And that's what we need, antioxidants. But if we don't have a diet that's high in those colorful fruits and vegetables and spices and herbs and plant-based foods that contain a lot of antioxidants, then again, the spoke of that orange is poking around looking for something else.
Absolutely. I think just to kind of summarize that in a different way, when we create energy, we create free radicals, and that's because the oxygen and the glucose in the mitochondria combine, and then you get some waste product. The waste product then causes damage. And then, as you said, these colorful things that we find in our fruits and vegetables, those are the antioxidants, and they prevent this free radicals causing more widespread damage, including on our DNA.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So I hope people get that. So I was going to move on from that. What I want to do is, we talked a little bit about fat and muscle, and I thought it'd be interesting to get your take on the BMI. It's been a lot in the media recently, and there were some headlines and some press releases on BMI and the way we understand BMI. What are your thoughts on BMI?
So BMI, if you understand historically, it was discovered by, I think it's a Belgian scientist who actually looked at a population of white men. So first of all, men and women have very different body compositions. So BMI is automatically not working with women because our body composition is different. We need to have a different amount of essential fat as women. We need at least 12% essential fat, whereas men only need 3%. So of course, our body composition is different. And the BMI doesn't account for that body composition. It just really looks at your weight over your height. And because it was mainly done in a white population, obviously every ethnicity can be different. I mean, there's obviously just loads of variation in people, full stop, but that makes a huge difference. So BMI isn't always a good measure for women. It's not always a good measure for non-white people. It's not a good measure in lots of ways because, for example, you could have a sumo wrestler or a bodybuilder, let's say, who's technically their BMI is over 30, but they are just muscle. So when you think about their insulin response, it's going to be completely different because they've got loads of muscle as opposed to someone who's of the same weight where their body fat is maybe 30, 40, 50%, depending on which gender. But do you see where the difference comes? So that's why BMI, from my perspective, I don't think it's useful. I think a better measurement would be waist to hip ratio. I think waist to hip ratio is really useful to understand also, for example, for women, you want that to be 0.7. But for a lot of people, that fat around the middle, the belly, really impacts your metabolism and your insulin response and your insulin resistance and like your risk of metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, all things that we're talking about. So that's more important, that visceral fat. So you, as a person, you can share fat in different places. You can share it subcutaneously, which means under your skin, which a lot of women do, which is around your buttocks, your thighs. And actually that's way safer than around your belly, where it's around your essential organs. And we don't want
ratios. I think ratios can be hard to understand. In fact, I found them quite hard to get my head around when I was learning all these things in medical school and also since medical school compared to numbers. But ratios are really, really important. So let's just look at the waist hip ratio, because a lot of people look at that and sort of think of one measurement, like where is the waist and where's the hip? Can you kind of give a bit more of a description of that?
Yeah, and actually it's really interesting because there was a conversation we were having yesterday for some academic research that we're doing, looking at weight management in breast cancer patients. And it's really hard to know. So the hip is generally the widest part of your body around your buttocks and your hip bones. If you feel on your right hand, left side, you should be able to feel your hip bones. And that's where you would measure your hips. Now your waist is generally the smallest part, but it's not always the smallest part, because that's the whole point of the ratio. But it's generally more higher up around your belly button. Now, that's also problematic because someone like me, and I know we haven't talked about, but I have been diagnosed with breast cancer several times.
Well, we're going to come there. We're going to.
I've had something called a diet flap reconstruction where my belly button was removed and they made me a new one. So where is my belly button? So I have to kind of think about where it used to be, which is really like quite difficult.
Yeah. Would you say that the hips stay roughly the same all the way through and it's the waist that changes?
No, I think that can change too, because women, as I said, subcutaneous fat, they can put on more fat around their hips and their buttocks. And obviously if you're training, like let's say you're doing loads of like glute work, your hips are going to, it's going to grow, right? Because your muscle and your bottom is going to get bigger.
Yeah. Well, I've got to be honest, in my practice, although waist-hip ratio is really important, I don't use it just because it's harder. I think it's a much better metric. But the reason I don't use it is just because people don't monitor it that well. And that's one of the difficulties with these ratios. You have to measure two things and then you have to work out the ratio, or you put it in the calculator, and you have to be used to measuring it. I often just very simply use dress size. And I don't say that one person should be one specific dress size. It's relative to that person in the context of the rest of their health.
The problem is the dress size is different in which brand you wear. So it's very difficult. Like I know that I can be a size 8, one can be a size like 14. So it's crazy, like literally ridiculous. But I mean, just going back to the metrics, I mean, we have to kind of, we were in this particular piece of research that we were looking at. We're like, we are using BMI just because the NHS is using BMI, but we're also collecting these other metrics so that we can go back in the future, you know what I mean? To look at that data and understand what actually happened. And by having that data, we can then map it to see whether there's a difference. Because if people are on a weight loss program and they're exercising, theoretically, they can lose body fat and gain muscle, which will change their body composition, but also their body shape, right, as well. And so that becomes really interesting if we can just start collecting that data. I mean, for my personal preferences also, I really, if you ever buy it's kind of measure, which obviously people do not have in their homes, but they have at places like Boots, you can measure your body fat levels. And that's also a really interesting thing to know. And it's obviously different for men and women, but what we're starting to understand with the link with type 2 diabetes, and this data is completely extrapolated, and I keep looking for data around it, but I've got a few exercise physiologists, oncologists that I work with, and they're suggesting that the cutoff for women to reduce their risk, and you probably know more about this than me, to reduce their risk of diabetes is 32% body fat. Now, can that be extrapolated to breast cancer, where we want to get people down to 32% body fat to reduce their risk of recurrence or reduce their risk full stop?
Well, yes, okay, body fat percentage in women is higher than men in healthy people. That is expected. But the individual is different. So yes, I agree with those numbers on population-based data and for people who are perhaps in the pre-diabetes or early diabetes stage. But when people have had diabetes for much longer, I'm seeing that their body fat percentages are, say, 29, 30%, and we want to move it down slightly, but not to the point where it becomes detrimental to their health. Yeah. But we're not focusing necessarily on the body fat percentage. It's about the percentage is a comparison to the rest. So how do we flip it and start to increase the muscle mass as well to impact that body fat percentage rather than just consistently thinking about weight loss?
I absolutely agree. And one of the things I measure for myself is my muscle mass. And what I'm doing a lot of weightlifting on purpose for my bone health, for my muscle health, for my cognitive function. We know that there's a real link an inverse link between thigh muscle strength and longevity, cognitive health, all of those things. And so what I'm seeing is, irrespective of my body fat, kind of keeping my muscle mass is over someone of my age, because that's actually very important to me. And that also impacts your insulin resistance, that muscle. We keep talking about it being a really important buffer.
Become totally obsessed about women, postmenopausal women, maximizing their muscle gains.
Yeah, me too.
And actually, most of my clients are between the age of 50 and 70, and 90% are women. And nearly all of the stuff that we have to do in terms of the exercise is maximizing resistance exercise. 100%. And that is where the gains are to be made. I think people are used to doing a lot of aerobic exercise. I think we went through the 80s, 90s of maximizing aerobic exercise, and people got used to it and got to see lots of people doing it. And the idea of doing resistance exercise or lifting weights or using other types of materials to help you to get stronger was always male dominated. But I actually think that's changed in the 20s. Something's changed. I think even before then, I think in the 2010s, the narrative has started to change quite significantly. And now we've seen a real flip in that.
It has. But if you look at Gen X women who grew up in the 80s and 90s, who are your ideal patient, right? They're still in this...
Not my ideal patient. They're the ones that ones that are currently...
They're the patients, you see. They are still, a lot of them are still stuck in that eating low fat. They don't understand how, there's beneficial fats. They don't understand that muscle is really important. They're worried about being bulky, but we're never going to be bulky because we just don't have the same testosterone levels, particularly post-menopause. So, and what we know is that by resistance training is the best way of reducing abdominal and visceral fat. And yet women keep just continuing on this, like, I'm going to eat less calories, I'm going to eat less fat, I'm going to just do loads of cardio. Yeah. But the best way of changing your body composition, particularly postmenopausally, is eat more protein, eat the beneficial fats, resistance train as much as possible.
We're depriving the body of nutrients when we look for a low calorie, low fat approach. And if the body is going to change its composition, it needs protein and it needs fat. Every single cell in the body has fat as its wall structure. That's exactly it. And it includes lipids and cholesterol as part of that. So there's been a lot of misunderstanding of science and the way science has been interpreted over decades, which has led to a lot of confusing messages. And even online now, even I find it confusing. I listened to Stephen Bartlett podcast recently. Well-known diabetes person came on and had a chat with Stephen and basically said, we don't need fiber.
Oh dear.
But I am totally confused. I'm totally confused. And when the health professionals are confused, I can't imagine what it feels like for people who are not confused. And I even had to put a comment on Spotify on the podcast and be like, what am I meant to think when? And I embrace all conversations. And actually, to hold Stephen in high regard here, I do think, even though he hasn't directly responded to all the media backlash that happened a few months ago around misinformation and the information he's been providing, he challenged him, because this has happened since, and actually tried to bring in the alternative narrative around fiber and pushed him on it. It still is confusing.
Can I share a bit?
Go on then. Let's talk about fiber.
Fiber is one of the most important food groups, and we've neglected that.
Why? Why is fiber important?
Right. So fiber, first of all, we need soluble and insoluble fiber for our gut microbiome. Imagine there are thousands of different types of beneficial and not so beneficial bacteria and other organisms in your gut. They all love fiber. And just as we all have our favorite foods, each of these bacteria has their favorite foods, and it's a different form of fiber. And it needs to get into your gut. And that is, if you eat an apple, for example, it's got soluble and insoluble fiber. When you eat, it gets digested in your mouth into like a gel. This gel goes into your stomach where it's not fully digested. And then it goes into your colon, your lower kind of part of your intestine, and that is where the beneficial bacteria can have this soluble gel and eat it. And it not only does it provide short chain fatty acids, which are fuel for the gut cells and for the gut microbiome cells, these amazing bacteria, but it creates a whole lot of other metabolites which our body needs. And fiber is one of the key ways. As in the UK, the recommended amount of fiber is 30 grams a day. Women are reaching 19 grams, men much less, more like 17, 18 grams. And that just shows that we need so much more fiber. Fiber also helps to modulate the amount of calories that you get from a food. So if you had a load of almonds, if you put it into a measurement, a bomb calorimeter, which is how they measure calories, it would say it was X amount of calories, right? But when you take account of the fiber, actually you absorb way less of those calories. So if you process that and made it into peanut butter or put it into a smoothie where that gel isn't made, then obviously you're going to have a higher insulin response because it's digested more in your stomach rather than your colon. And that's why fiber is like the magic food.
I'm going to be devil's advocate just because I'm going to play it from the alternative view and we'll see how that plays out. So the alternative view is that he said, well, this was the argument that came back from Stephen or something along these lines. And then he said, well, why do we need good gut bacteria. And then I hear what you're saying. You're saying, well, these good gut bacteria protects our gut, but also creates new metabolites, other things that the body can utilize. And also there's the calorie side of it as well. And then there's other anti-inflammatory effects as well. Lots of benefits. But then the argument that this person was saying is that if you have no carbs whatsoever, zero carbs, so carbs, usually fibre is a form of carb, but it's a non-absorbable form of carb. When you have none of that, then none of this matters. Do you think that's complete nonsense?
It's complete nonsense, but also you can't have low carb vegetables and fibre. So if you look at all your dark leafy greens, any of your greens, they're low. Things like radish, low carbs.
But he's saying, but the argument is no carbs, so then you cut out the fibre argument altogether.
Yeah, no, I don't agree with that, because we've shown in so many epidemiological studies that we need our gut microbiome, and the only thing that the gut microbiome, whether it's bacteria, other organisms eat, is fibre. And plus, we need to make serotonin. Our immune system is based on our gut microbiome, a healthy way. So if you don't eat that, you have an immune system. You make vitamin K. You make loads of other things. So we need that. Yeah. So I don't know what data and what this person's talking about, and I guess
the argument
diet, but I don't agree with it. Yeah. So I don't think it's typically solid.
Well, it is very confusing. It still remains very confusing to me. I guess the argument would be that if you didn't need any carbs whatsoever, then you don't need to worry about the gut microbiome and the impacts from fiber, because you'll get all the other nutrients from the meat, providing that the meat is high quality. And then they'll argue and say that the epidemiological studies on meat are related to, they haven't removed the processing of the meat from the meat that isn't processed.
No, that's a fair point, like with the meat. But you can't just get all your calories. I think the whole point is that we need to be metabolically flexible. You need to be able to get calories from protein and fat, like maybe more of a low carb ketogenic diet, and you need to be able to get, make energy from, having carbohydrate based foods. But the fiber is non-negotiable. It's not actually involved in the equation. It's conflating too many arguments.
Well, for me, I mean, I'm certainly not arguing his point of view, but this metabolic flexibility is super, super key, because if you do go no carb and you do go keto, you lose metabolic flexibility. People think you're going to get more metabolic flexibility, but actually the data shows that if you're fully no carb, you actually store less immediately available insulin. So that when you do have some carb, your glucose rise is so significant and your body can't process it. And then you've lost metabolic flexibility. So like we might lose metabolic flexibility if we're totally always burning glucose, we may, and taking a high carb diet, we may also lose the flexibility if we go the other way. And then the other thing is around quality of food and our ability to think about food as enjoyment, and also lots of foods. How can we only eat 2 or 3 main sources of food? It's virtually impossible, surely.
No, and when you think about food being cultural, social, all of those different things, we eat for pleasure. We don't just eat for fuel. But the quality of the meat, and most people can't source that high quality kind of food.
And that is where the price really does go up in terms of cost of food.
Yeah. And then it becomes not equitable, and it's not, it doesn't serve all. Plus also culturally, some people are vegetarian, vegan, don't eat eggs, all of those things. So then we have to think about that too. Yeah. And
well, I think people who are choosing to go down this route of a carnivore or no carb approach they're playing with a lot less available data compared to taking on the fiber and the higher quality nutrients across the whole board and embracing metabolic flexibility and choosing all aspects. I feel like there's a bit more of a risk to take this approach, a huge risk.
It's a huge risk, but also there's no epidemiological data because no communities really do that. If you think about the communities, and I'm bringing me straight, if you think about paleo diet, in the hunter-gatherer times, people ate berries and leaves and all sorts of things when they couldn't hunt and catch these, when it was in season. When you think about the Inuits, the Eskimos, they do have a predominantly fat-based diet, but again, they have other things. So it's the quality, right? They were having these wild caught salmon, which people, I'm sorry, but some man in, I'm just going to say Hull, isn't eating that. I'm sorry.
People from Hull are going to be listening, Toral.
Wherever, but I'm trying to, but my point being, it's hard to source these, because we do not have good wild fish in the UK. It grows around us, a lot of our salmon and fat fish, I apologize to people
but
from
you're
Hull.
Right.
It's not it's farmed fish, it's not wild. And that, wild fish is still really caught more like Alaska and Pacific.
I think the key here is variety, quality, colors, meat, non-meat, having the flexibility to choose a whole variety and host of foods rather than just fixing yourself into this is the only things that I eat for my health, which is a bit extreme.
The problem is, like, in my clinical practice, when I see people who've done really restrictive diets, generally their immune health has gone down, their immune system is not working quite so well, and so they become ill. They're more likely to be deficient. I have several patients who, for fear, have started eating less and less and less and less, and because they're so scared of different things. And it doesn't matter what it might be restricted. So I'll give you an example. If someone has become gluten-free, dairy-free, legume-free, because they're like, it's psychosomatic and it's impacting their gut health. But it's because they've become so restrictive, and then they've got now deficiencies with vitamin B, complex, different vitamin Bs, is making it worse and worse. And it makes their gut a little bit more leaky or whatever it might be. And so if they ate more different types of food, and then conversely, I've had people who followed cancer bloggers, a variety, and I'm not going to name names, but whether they've gone from like a fully keto, like a ketos actually got some data, but like a carnivore diet or fully vegan raw food diet, where those people, I've had a patient who lost 15 kilos in like 3 months by following this cancer blogger and a raw food vegan diet. And they were so deficient. And actually, to be really, really honest, it was very sad because their body just couldn't tolerate their chemotherapy and they died. And that was heartbreaking. We need to have more understanding. And what I was really upset about is that the hospital did not realize this weight loss. I admit it was in COVID, but like while they're having their chemotherapy, they're weighing them to give the right chemotherapy doses. So why did they not know that they lost so much weight?
Yeah. Oh, there's so much there. And I'm going to not address it right now because there's other things. Yeah. But look, on the subject of cancer and your own story, I would like to hear about your story. And I think other people would like to hear that because I think it's influenced a lot of the things that you do. And as part of it, I would also really be interested to know not just about your health story, but also your career story, because you've had an interesting career story aside from the health side as well. So let's hear about it all.
Yeah. So it's all kind of linked together. And I was a very precocious 11-year-old that read a book about a cancer surgeon. And I thought, right, I'm going to cure cancer, because obviously at 11, that's what you think you could do. So, I'm also a South Asian woman. So the natural thing was to go into medical school. So off I trotted. And, in the UK, you apply for medical school when you're really quite young, particularly depending on your birthday or when it is in the year. But I was 16. I knew nothing. Got to medical school after gap year and didn't love it. And then my mum was diagnosed with breast cancer. And my plan was to become an oncologist treating cancer patients. And Mum was diagnosed, and I just thought, oh my God, is this what oncologists do? I didn't realize it's just a lot of needles and poking people and giving them drugs involved. I saw my mum through this process of having surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, hormone treatment. And then she was just left. And this is, 26 years ago. And I just thought, well, how do you help people recover? They go through this. And at those times in the early 2000s, the rate was 1 in 4 people had cancer. It's now changed to 1 in 2. And I kept thinking, but what are we doing about prevention? What are we doing about risk reduction? What are we doing to stop people having recurrence after they've had? Because we knew the rate hasn't really changed. 30% of people who have breast cancer have recurrence and have metastatic disease. And that hasn't really changed. Why? And I really kind of became disillusioned as the more research I did. And that was my own. This is me digging around in the dusty library because there was no internet in those days. Shows how old I am. But, I really kind of became very disillusioned with medicine because I was like, why are we not looking at nutrition and lifestyle? So I actually had a bit of a break, worked in research for a while in cancer research in Stark oncogenes, which is just kind of a gene that's linked to cancer. And then went back and did a master's in nutritional medicine over 21 years ago, wanting to specialize in cancer. Because I was like, I want to help. I don't want to treat cancer patients. I want to reduce their risk. And if I do help look after them, I want to reduce their risk of recurrence. And that's what my master's thesis was about. But when I was doing that part of that master's at the last module, I was very good at self-checking, which I know a lot of people in the early 20s aren't. Everyone should really know their bodies, whether it's their chest or their pecs or breasts or whatever it is, and other parts of your body. I've noticed a lump. And no one believed me apart from my mum. Eventually went to GP. My GP was like, wait, she's a new female GP. She didn't believe me despite having a very strong family history. My mum, my aunt, loads of my mum's cousins have had breast cancer. I kind of didn't really.
How old were you at this time?
29. And no one really did an urgent referral. Luckily, my mum works in NHS and medical care, and somehow I managed to see one of her radiologist friends. And my mum worked in radiology, and they did an ultrasound, and they're like, "Oh, we're going to do a biopsy." And I knew in that moment I had breast cancer, and before anyone said anything. So I went to the appointment the week later, but on my own. And I walked in, and I saw the surgeon that my mum had treated my mum, and I saw the breast cancer, and I just thought, "Oh, bleep, bleep, bleep." And, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a very early stage. It was it was ductal carcinoma in situ, which means it's trapped in the milk duct with a little bit of microinvasion. And, so super early caught. So there's definitely, hopefully, an impact that my lifestyle and nutrition made onto trapping it and not letting it spread everywhere. But I did require mastectomy. I did have hormone treatment. Didn't need chemotherapy or radiotherapy that time. And so my kind of life's passion is that. I do specialize in breast cancer, but also prostate cancer and other cancers too. But really, I already knew that there was a whole wealth of science, but we weren't applying that. No doctors or oncologists or surgeons seem to know anything about nutrition, lifestyle, about reducing risk of recurrence or supporting people. And that's essentially what I'm very passionate about, and is my life's work. And I have had, for transparency, 2 recurrences since locally in the skin, because I had something called a skin sparing mastectomy, where they kept the skin. So imagine an apple. If you have an apple and you kind of remove all the flesh, there's always going to be 1 or 2 bits from the skin. You're always going to have a couple of cells left. And those were a couple of cancer cells left. So they had literally my skin. So I have had more surgery, and I've had extended radiotherapy but I've also had that skin removed and replaced with a panel for my stomach, which is why I was talking about the belly button thing. And so I don't have that skin anymore. So obviously that helps reduce the risk. And, I do a lot of different things to help continually reduce my risk of recurrence. And that local recurrence isn't the same as systemic recurrence. So I've never had spread to my lymph nodes or anything like that. It's very much localized in the skin that was still remaining from the original cancer. And, removing it is obviously a really great form of treatment. And so this made me really passionate. And then it also made me realize that as a young South Asian woman who had been in medicine, who worked in oncology already, worked in nutrition and cancer and lifestyle, people didn't believe me. And the amount of people I had to talk to, no one believed me. That, even when I've had reoccurrences, I've had to go to the NHS 17 times, say, look, there's a problem. This is what I know. And it's frustrating because the rate of cancer incidence is growing in young people, but also women of color, non-white women in the UK have to go to the GP 2.3 times more to be diagnosed with breast cancer. And that's, for me, is shocking and disappointing.
That's a lot to take in, isn't it, at 29?
Yeah. And losing your breast at 29 is horrible. You're very body conscious. You're also worried about, meeting somebody. You're worried about your sexuality. You're worried about having babies. There's a whole load of things. My mother had a mastectomy at 49, but she had 2 grown-up children in her 20s. Me being 29 and being single was completely different. And no one was really talking about it in those days. Now we have social media, and there are loads of younger cancer kind of people talking about it. But, I had to really work at finding other people. And I found this amazing younger women's breast cancer support group. And, I'm still friends with some of those women. Sadly, some of those have passed away. But that's really where there's been such a shift and a change. And now this understanding why our rates of cancer massively increasing, whatever cancer it might be, in young people. And what we know is that it can't just be genetic, because it's only one generation. If you think about 2020 and 2000, it's 20 years apart, right? The rate of cancer has changed from 1 in 4 people will have cancer to 1 in 2 people. That isn't just genetics, it's one generation. It's obviously our diet and lifestyle.
Yes. Could genetics change epigenetics?
Absolutely.
Change.
So our diet and lifestyle can switch genes on and off. I'm a genomics practitioner, and I'm very passionate about it. So when it comes to cancer, I think people get quite confused, genetics and genomics. So when it comes to cancer, there are known genes, mutations in genes, which can increase your risk of certain cancers. So if we take, for example, BRCA1 or BRCA2, one of the most known genes that many people know about, that can massively increase your risk of breast cancer and other cancers, including pancreatic and, gynecological cancers. The penetrance can be up to 80%, meaning that, it can increase your risk. But obviously, some people can have that mutation and nothing happens, right? But then there's also other things that we have as humans, variation, called single nucleotide polymorphisms. These are just genetic variations in who we are as human beings. Everyone has them. Now, those genetic mutations can either be beneficial, neutral, or less beneficial. And those genes, and knowing those changes, we can switch genes on and off with our diet and lifestyle. So, for example, let me find a good example. So let's think about sleep. Because sleep, we produce a hormone called melatonin, and that, is produced when it starts to get dark at nighttime. Now, people can have mutations. So, for example, my whole family has mutations in this making the enzymes that code for like making a melatonin, and we're very poor at making melatonin. So that
I feel sorry for your parents when trying to put you guys to sleep when you were kids.
No. Well, what's crazy about it? This can manifest differently. Me, horrible to put to sleep. I was like constantly crying, blah blah. My brother just used to go to sleep, but now what we're realizing is his quality of sleep is poor, and obviously that lack of sleep can impact your risk of other diseases, physiologically. So this is just an example of like genetic mutations, and it's not life-threatening. But then when we come back to cancer, just 1 second, 3 different types. There's one is the genetic mutation. So inherited breast cancer, it only accounts for 5 to 10% breast cancers. There's familial breast cancer, which accounts for 15 to 20%, where you have some from family history with breast cancer, but you don't have any of these known mutations. But maybe you have lots and lots of these single nucleotide polymorphism, and then there's everybody else, which is like, again, 70 to 80%. So we're still learning about this.
So on these 3 aspects, is there kind of a spectrum that one is the genetic mutation, single genes affecting risk?
Yeah.
Then there's familial, which is a number of genes together affecting risk.
Which we still don't know much about, but yes.
We don't know much about. And then there is everyone else, which is more to do with the environment, but still maybe impacting even more genetics together.
Potentially. And it also could be done back down to our original conversation was the metabolism and metabolics, and like in the link with insulin resistant metabolic syndrome. That's our diet and lifestyle, right?
Yes. Okay. In your case, 29, do you have any more understanding now, having this is your career as well, and as to why you think it happened to you at 29?
Yeah. So everybody else in like my extended family has had, either kind of menopausal kind of or postmenopausal or perimenopausal breast cancer. So in fact, my mum is the other next youngest person. Well, she was. Everyone else was very firmly menopausal. My mum went through menopause through treatment. And we have one other cousin now who's been diagnosed at like 44, who's obviously potentially perimenopausal, but not menopausal anyway. Maybe not menopausal at all, but anyway, whatever. So what we're starting to understand is with these families, by looking at families where younger people have breast cancer, where they haven't had any of these known genes, there are these single nucleotide polymorphisms, up to 300 of them, which can impact breast cancer risk. We just don't know enough about that. We need to map more people. And so there's definitely things. But the other thing you've got to remember in families is certainly, especially with like mother and daughter or siblings, is they often have the same lifestyle. How do you separate that out too? Because especially if you're growing up in the same household, at that point I lived at home. So most of that time, obviously university and all the rest of it, but like majority of my time would have been spent with my family. So whilst by then I'd already been educated in nutrition and I was probably doing a lot of the cooking at home, and it's still, do you see what I mean? There's lots of this.
So why a decade earlier for you?
Yeah, more than a decade earlier, like 15, 20 years. So one thing I do know, having now done my genomics, is that my whole family's genomics, is that we have mutations on the estrogen receptor 1 and 2. Again, and without going into the process, but basically that impacts, there's a negative and positive feedback look. So that impacts how you utilize and what your body requires. That my dad had prostate cancer too. So that's super interesting that I kind of inherited mutations from both sides of the family. My dad's family is a side of prostate cancer, which, you don't always think of it immediate, but we definitely know now there's, some sort of link.
We know there's a link with the breast cancer genes and prostate cancer and melanoma.
Exactly.
So is this the genes that you're talking about? You're talking about different genes.
I'm talking about different genes. I'm talking about
but they're affecting the estrogen receptors.
Yeah, estrogen receptors, there's lots of known knowledge about those where people have estrogen receptor mutations potentially can have more likely to have metastatic breast cancer, which obviously we do not have. But we're still learning, it's emerging science, but we also started to learn that with prostate cancer, because one of the treatments for prostate cancer is tamoxifen, which is used in breast cancer. It's an estrogen blocking drug. So yeah, there's that. But there's also, we know that our sleep is linked. We know that stress management is linked. We know that how you detoxify estrogen metabolites is linked. And I know what mutations I have in my own family because I've tested, but that doesn't mean that's not coming to clinical practice as yet fully. That's something we need to learn more about.
Did you, and I know I'm pushing on one case and it's your case.
My case.
But
okay.
I think it's interesting, but it's really interesting to ask questions about it because it's just like, you're the expert in the diet and lifestyle side of it. You've experienced it and you help other people with this. So that's why I find it really fascinating. If it's okay to ask some more questions on this.
100%. So one of the things I've realized anecdotally when I talk to younger women is a lot of them had some sort of trauma in the year or 18 months before they're diagnosed. And I would love to do a PhD in looking at the link between stress, diet and lifestyle, and estrogen positive cancers. Because what we know is that some of the enzymes that are used to break down the estrogen metabolites are also similar to the enzymes or the same, or in the same pathway as those used to break down cortisol. Our body will break down cortisol preferentially to these estrogen metabolites. So then do you end up with more estrogens in your body, like different types of metabolites in your body? And that's my personal thought process. I don't know. We haven't done the science. So, but that's just one element of it. I had a very, very bad breakup 18 months before I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I also have to state these other things. I was eating all the right things dietary-wise. I was very lean. I was doing triathlons and doing appropriate amounts of exercise, if not extra, way more than a normal person. And when we look at exercise, we know that doing a minimum of 150 minutes a week of physical activity plus 2 strength sessions. I was doing way more than that. I think my sleep was definitely poor. My stress management was not good. My emotional regulation wasn't necessarily good. My environment toxins, I had stripped a lot of things out well before I had breast cancer. I was one of the early adopters of kind of removing plastics and BPAs and phthalates and all of those things. But I'm obviously genetically predisposed too. But we also remember that I've never had spread. It's been contained.
Yes.
So that's my diet.
Was alcohol a factor at all? Did you drink alcohol at university? Was that a factor?
Alcohol, but I wouldn't say I was necessarily. I mean, I think there's probably more binge drinking in those days, but less.
There was always more binge drinking in the 2000s, wasn't there?
Yeah, there was.
1990s, 2000s.
I wouldn't say I necessarily drank. I didn't drink every day, of course. I would maybe once a week, but there was that binge drinking. Not binge, because I also could go through months where I just wouldn't drink at all. I was one of those people that didn't need it to socially have fun. I don't need it as a social lubricant. I'm just like that. So I don't know how much alcohol was a factor in my personal case. I do think it is for lots of people. We know now, and if you look at all the different cancer organizations, everyone's basically agreed that now it's a grade 1 carcinogen and we should put warnings on any alcohol.
So, I mean, what I'm taking from this is there's a family history. Family history does not mean cancer in the next generation, but it's genetics or family history times by or in combination with lifestyle. And lifestyle is more than just nutrition and exercise. It's about the stress that you experience. It's not like lifestyle is the way we think about lifestyle. It's what you experience, what happens to you in the environment that you're living in, as well as the things you have control of. And it's that in combination with the genetics that can lead to a disease or health expression.
100%.
And in your case, something flipped and it led to a cancer forming.
Exactly. And when we look at social determinants of health, there's a beautiful model. We know that stress from systemic, stress that can impact our body in so many ways, but we also know that, things that can be psychological stress, like job issues, financial issues, racism, all of these things can occur physiologically, can impact your body physiologically, the physiological stress response. So we can't discount that either.
Absolutely. There's a really good study done of civil servants in the UK, and it followed people for a number of years, and they did 2 sets of cohorts in it. But in the study, they did lots of different analysis of it, and they found that middle-aged women who experienced a significant stressful episode, such as a breakup or bereavement, in the last, I think it was, someone will have to check it for me, I think in the last 3 years, were 40% more likely to develop type 2 diabetes in the next year.
it's just so interesting when I'm talking about stress and what my personal theory is, like with this link with cancer. It's the same with that. Like, we know that stress impacts how all the different hormones we produce in our body, cortisol, noradrenaline, how it breaks it down. And, women of middle age are often in a sandwich generation. They're caring for children. They're caring for aging parents. They're also working. They're trying to do everything. They have very little time for themselves to self-care. And so the stress, like, the amount of people I speak to, my peers who have children and families, I know I'm sitting here in Mexico, but like, they're having a really difficult time just juggling the day-to-day things because there isn't the social structure to support them. And women are doing the most kin-keeping and the caretaking still in our patriarchal world.
Yeah. Well, there's a narrative there that we're building, which is that whether it's cancer, and we've talked specifically today about breast cancer, or whether it's metabolic syndrome, and a lot of that is related to diabetes that we talked about, there's the similar things happening. So there is a genetic predisposition, which is different for everyone. And then there is the environment in which we're living in and the lifestyles in which we're playing out within the environments. And all of that together is then leading to whether we can express health or express potentially a disease or illness. There's one, we are running out of time, but I think it's really, really important that we cover some of the narratives that I haven't addressed in what you've been saying, which is around different ethnic groups and experiences in healthcare and experiences in, and health outcomes. So you mentioned some really powerful things there. You mentioned that someone who is non-white needs to go to see the doctor much more frequently to get a diagnosis of breast cancer. Is that right?
Yeah, particularly if they're younger.
And particularly if they're younger. Tell me a little bit about that, but also that in the context of the health advocacy work that you do.
So we know that outcomes in the UK and obviously and the US actually, and Canada, where we've collected most of the data, where there's ethnically diverse groups, outcomes are much poorer for South Asian women, for Black women, for LGBTQI groups, and marginalized and underserved groups. There's so many different elements in that. A lot of it's social determinants of health, but there's also systemic inequality within our system, or our healthcare system, or our sick care system. And there's a lot of bias still. And I was lucky enough to be at the Tackling Health Inequalities conference at the Royal Society of Medicine 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago. And it was brilliant because there were loads of people from different groups coming together to talk about this. Yet we are preaching to the converted there. That is a minority. If you look at boards of hospital, only 7% of boards of hospital are non-white male. Like, there's a gender disparity.
7%.
Yeah.
But hold on a minute. But 50% of medical professionals are doctors, roughly 40%? I mean, sorry, medical professionals are females.
Yes, exactly. So there's a gender disparity and there's ethnic disparity. And for me, these health inequalities are so important. So, finally we have Dame Leslie Regan, who's now responsible for women's health. So we've never had a women's health strategy. We don't currently have a cancer plan in the UK. So all of these inequalities are building up and we definitely need to address them. And a lot of it's to do with not just early diagnosis and prevention and all those things, but it's also treatment. So people of color are way less likely to be offered clinical trials. Things aren't explained to them in the same way. There aren't products. For example, I had radiotherapy. I've actually light skin as a person of color, and I had real side effects from the radiotherapy, and my skin was really damaged and it all fell off. It was horrible. And, we haven't had research, but my friend Namanjolka Anderson is now putting together a scale to help clinicians understand that, it can impact skin differently. All the textbooks have white skin. We haven't had. So we don't know what it looks like in brown or black skin. So there's so many systemic inequalities within our system, whether it's for women or people of different ethnicities or the LGBTQI group or trans people or, and we need to address that because essentially NHS is supposed to be free healthcare for all. Generally, as humans, we want to have equitable health, not equality, equitable. Equitable means the difference is we give people the resources they require to look after their health. When it comes to equality, you're giving everyone the same. But equitable is like you give people different things too. So, for example, some of the prevention and awareness information for South Asians is different because we're very disparate groups in our South Asians, hugely highly educated ones, and really people who don't know anything about and won't talk about their bodies, and there's a lot of taboos. So we need different sorts of information. People still, let me give you a really quick story before we wrap up. When I was being wheeled down for my first cancer surgery, age 29, I was seen by a South Asian anaesthetist who actually knew my mother, my family. And she said to me, don't worry, I won't tell anyone. I know you want to get married. And I was like, A, Hippocratic oath, you can't tell people. And number two, I tell people I've done nothing wrong. Someone who's that educated, has that kind of mentality around cancer and hiding it. What do we have hope do we have for other people?
Absolutely.
So we need to change within our system, the healthcare system, the medical, but also within our own cultures. We need to, and gender thing needs to change too. Like, we need way more gender parity in the UK. And, we're one of the lowest when it comes to the G20 countries. Yeah. We have the poorest outcomes for cancer in the G20 countries.
Yeah,
we have poor
health.
We're the most obese, but we also have really poor gender parity.
Yeah. So I think so often people just look at the treatment that people receive, but it's so much more than just the receiving of treatment. It's the diagnosis of it. And then also looking back as to how people interplay in their environment. And all of the way through this, you're essentially saying that we're looking at white males predominantly, at research, at treatment, at access. Is that essentially what you're saying here? And that is then leading to worsened health outcomes for so many parts of society.
And I do have to acknowledge that right now, we're watching the United States where they're removing from all their research terms things like women, gender equity, trans, minorities, ethnic minorities, underserved communities. They're removing those terms from any research grant. So if you apply, you can't. Yeah. That is massive going to impact anyone that's not a white man.
Absolutely, because we're now homogenizing everyone as one group.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. What is the progress that you're seeing? Where are you getting progress here?
There's small pockets of progress. We have an amazing, the NHS has got an NHS Race and Health Observatory. There's this Women's Health Collective that I'm part of, which is led by Dr. Leslie Regan and Dr. Nigger Arif, which is really looking at inequalities for women. There's amazing different charities doing different work. And, Macmillan have got a whole new kind of CEO, and they're looking at, underserved groups. And rather than trying to do the work themselves, working with trusted organizations in groups. There's lots happening. I've just had my previous meeting was with an oncology registrar who kind of can see these inequalities in both clinical practice and her work that she does with Professor Ebola Olawabi, who's kind of leading some of this health inequalities work. But there's a long way to go. We're kind of a small group of people. The majority of, are able, and they're not, we need to also decolonize healthcare. Even as Black and brown people, we are own worst, enemies sometimes. And I don't want to go into details about that, but I think that's a whole other discussion and podcast. But, we need to decolonize medicine. Remember, there's been health and healing for thousands of years. It's not just westernized medicine that's had, when we look at integrative oncology, integrative medicine, we're taking on conventional health, but we're healthcare, but also these thousands of years old healing modalities like yoga or meditation or whatever it might be. So
absolutely,
there's a whole aspect too. And then we need to provide resources about nutrition and lifestyle, etc., which are appropriate. Like, it's no point, my South Asian clients, I can't tell them to eat quinoa and kale. That'd be useless. What they need is what they can eat in their South Asian food that we can make culturally appropriate, but also tasty and able to it,
And we've both been testing a product recently that when you put in South Asian foods or even West African foods, they're not coming up in the system, even though the system is built on generative AI, which is a global software. So this is a major issue, because it's not even that the designers have designed it like this. It's like they've put in software that is also flawed. The whole thing, every single power.
Most AI designers are white male. And so they come with their cognitive bias of white male. And so there's that. And then when we look at genomics, 12% of the global population is white, yet roughly between 88 to 93% of genomic data is based on white people. So we have a lot to do. There's a lot of work to do.
Yes, there's a lot to do. Okay, you mentioned integrated care and integrative care, and you've actually just changed your persona, I would say, online, or what you do. You haven't changed what you do, but actually you've changed a little bit about your name online. So before we sign off and get a few insights, summaries from what we've talked about today, I'd love for you just to tell us what that's all about and how people can find out more about your work as well.
So when 20 something years ago, I started a brand called Urban Kitchen because people just didn't understand nutrition, and how I reeled them in was by food and cooking, because people were really into food then, they loved all the food shows. So that's how I used to reel them in. I used to trick them. And so Urban Kitchen worked as a consultancy, and it just was my name. And I realized that, I do a lot of academic research now. I do a lot of writing of articles, whether it's in, medium press or whether it's, scientific press. And my name is Toral Shah. So I need to have that association because there's otherwise no association. And also I do so much more than nutrition. Looking at the lifestyle, it's looking at your sleep, your stress management, your physical activity, your environment toxins, your social health, all of those the systemic issues in healthcare. And that is integrative health. So I wanted to bring that together. So that was the change. I mean, what I do is completely the same. It's just a different name. And, I really believe in there's so much that we don't know yet. And there's so much to learn. But what we do know is that, it can't just all be pills. There's so much more we could do with our diet and lifestyle.
What's the name of your website?
It's www.toralshah.co.uk.
Great. So people can just search your name and they'll find you online. Who are you working with? Who are you see clients as well, don't you? You do all this other work, but you also see clients one-to-one. So who are the clients that you see one-to-one?
So most of the patients, firstly, I have an integrative oncology course for anyone that's been affected by primary breast cancer diagnosis. And I say primary because it's different from metastatic patients. So they can just do the course even if they can't afford to work with me one-on-one. And I always have scholarships for Black and brown people. So they should definitely get in touch with me. But then I also see clients on a one-to-one basis. I have to be honest, I see mainly two groups of people. One is people who've been diagnosed already with cancer and people who want to reduce their risk and optimize their health generally. And they've had family history or they've had some sort of scare and they want to reduce their risk or reduce their risk of recurrence. And those are the people I really work with. I mean, obviously I could work with so many people, but that's an area I like to work with and specialize just because I've got the most in-depth knowledge. And I'm one of the few people that works in nutrition and lifestyle who is creating resources which are based for South Asian and Black people and inclusive of all.
Thank you very much. So you can find Toral Shah on the internet. You can find her on socials at
Toral Shah Integrative Health on Instagram. And I'm sure you'll find me in other places too. I can't remember all of them.
Great. Thank you. I mean, look, okay, so we have to sign off the conversation. So from your perspective, Toral, can you give us 2 or 3 key messages that you want to make sure people take from today? So
one is you can change your family history by changing your diet and lifestyle and reducing your risk of cancer and risk of reoccurrence. Second is please strength train, please build muscle. And the third thing is, we're all individuals and we're personal. So what will work for one person won't necessarily be the most important thing for someone else. So really integrative, personalized care is really important.
Thank you so much, Toral. It's been great having you on the podcast today.
Been so great to chat to you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll speak soon.